morning we continue a series of lessons on having the right relationship between ourselves and our stuff and our God. In the first week we considered how all of our things, all of our stuff, even life itself, are gifts from God, and that we have each been given labors to multiply those gifts, to bring fruit from them. Last week we considered whether money is indeed the root of all evil, and discovered that money is just an icon. It is just a placeholder which represents gifts and labor, and the real root of evil is the love of money, or covetousness. So it's a heart problem, not a wallet problem. And the medicine for such an ailment, according to St. Paul, is godliness with contentment. Whereas he writes in 1 Timothy 6, where we get the verse, the love of money is the root of all evils. He writes before that, now godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. And Hebrews 13:5 says, let your conduct be without covetousness. Be content with such things as you have, for God himself has said, I will never leave you or forsake you. So this week we look further into this idea of contentment, that elusive treasure which is more valuable than silver or gold. Well, St. Paul's the one who was teaching us, so let's start with him. He was a master of contentment. He had practiced it in his life and cultivated it throughout his entire time. He had been through so many things, so many difficulties, yet at the end of the day, found contentment in his life. These experiences inspired him to write some of the most incredible scriptures that we have, right? One of the most inspiring quotes that we have, many of you learn as young children. It's, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Have you heard that before? Have you ever said that to yourself before? Have you ever said that to your kids? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And if the church was a gym, and instead of icons on the walls, we had motivational posters, you can bet that there would be a big picture of a sweating person running or lifting weights, and underneath it would have that verse, right? But maybe a little less well-known and inspiring are the verses which immediately precede that verse, which are in Philippians chapter 4, we'll start at verse 11. St. Paul says, I have learned, in whatever state I am, to be content. I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned to be both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. So the immediate context of that verse is actually all about contentment. I know how to be abased. I know how to abound. I know how to suffer need. The main result of the strengthening that he is talking about, that he experienced, was not that he was successful in all things and managed to accomplish everything that he set his heart to do. He didn't get the results that he always wanted. Rather, what he did find is that he could accept the way that things turned out. It was not so much that he could do all things, but that he could get through all things. The race that he ran, and he talked of his life as a race that he was running, was not a sprint. It was not a record-breaking Usain Bolt Olympic performance. It was a long-distance endurance race, longer than the marathon. And it wasn't about coming in first, it was just about completing it. So, does that verse maybe sound a little less inspiring now? Maybe so. But you know what? That's actually really okay. Because we could go forward in life wondering why we can't seem to do all the things that we want to do. And we wonder why Christ doesn't seem to be strengthening us as much as we need him to. And too many setbacks and too many failures, and we could lose our faith altogether if we had the wrong understanding of what Christ's strength is about. Or we could realize the proper context of the verse. It's about contentment with the results, not the results themselves. It's about attitude. It's about acceptance. It's about having serenity, courage, and wisdom, and knowing the proper place and the proper order of operation. You know, today we are celebrating, as we just sang the hymns, the feast day of St. Sergius of Radonezh. Maybe some of you know a little bit about him. Maybe this is the first time you've ever heard of him. He's one of the most influential saints in the history of the church, very important to the development of the life of the church in Russia, and basically set forward a spiritual direction for it for centuries. I told some of his story last night at the Vespers, but there's one part of that story that illustrates, there's many parts, but there's one in particular I want to share with you that demonstrates the point. St. Sergius had become the abbot of his small community of semi-hermits living in the forest. And they were very strict. He wanted them to be completely self-sufficient, and he made it a strict rule of this community that they were not to accept donations from outside the community. They were not to accept alms. And so, as you might guess, they were actually very poor. And when they came together to have church, they couldn't even afford to have candles or oil lamps. So they burned little twigs and branches so that they could have light to read their books by. And their books were so poor that they had to transcribe them on birch bark, which is not the easiest thing to do or to read. And they had very little to eat to boot, and not surprisingly, they began to starve. And one time when Sergius himself had not eaten himself for 3 days, he went apparently to another monk nearby, knocked on his door, and he said, "Hey, I hear you want a new door on your little cell here. I'll do it for you if you just give me some stale bread." And the monk was like, "Abbot, Abba, Sergius, Father, all I have is some moldy bread. You can have it." He said, "No, I'm not even going to touch it until I get the job done." And so he worked all day, and he built the door, and he fixed the thing, and then he got the moldy bread. That was his first meal in days. And when he got back to the rest of the community, guess what? They were all up in arms, and they must have heard what was going on and saw the future for themselves. And they said, "That's it! We're done with this. We're starving. We're going to leave. We'll never see us again. This is ridiculous." And St. Sergius, of course, as you might expect, said, "Oh, don't worry. Be humble, have faith. God will provide." And just then, at that moment, there was a great knock at the door. And the porter went out to the outside of the monastery and came back in and said, "Abba, somebody has come and brought a whole wagon load of bread." And all the monks turned and they looked at Sergius. He said, "Please, can you once relax the rule so we can have something to eat? We're starving." And in his wisdom, Abba Sergius said, "Okay, let them come in and bring the food." And they sat down and they had their first, real meal, just bread, but it was, good, fresh, sustaining. And then after a while of eating, he finally got around to saying, "Where's the guys who brought this stuff?" And the porter said, "They said only to say that this was donated by someone who loves Christ, and that he had other work he had to go and do." And he left. So, you may think then, your first impression might be that this story is a vindication of St. Sergius' faith and piety, his intensity, his strict rigor. But actually, it's not. It's really the opposite. Through this experience, he learned that to be content, you have to learn to accept circumstances. You have to learn to accept not only need, but also abundance, gifts as well as labors. Self-sufficiency can sometimes be nothing more than a cover for pride and stubbornness, obstinacy, right? How many of us have pushed and pushed and pushed on something, just keep on going, just keep doing this, and somehow we'll get a different result, which is the definition of insanity, right? That's not how life works. Shortly after this incident, this full-scale mutiny that he was about to experience, the bishop told Sergius, really, you guys need to kind of normalize your monastery, make it a proper cenobium, a community place, build your buildings right, eat the right food, live the right monastic life. And so they began accepting donations, little by little. They lived in proper community. They still practiced a strict asceticism, as you might expect, but it was sustainable. And over time, this strengthened the community so that it built the greatest monastery in Russia, which is still today really the heart of Russian spirituality, the St. Sergius Holy Trinity Lavra. So wherever we see the word content or contentment in the New Testament, the root of the word comes from the Greek verb archeo, and that literally means to ward something off, to separate something off, but with the implication of saying, it's enough. It's like those monks when they said, that's it, it's enough. We've had enough. We can no longer take any more. It's setting the limits. And honest sufficiency is knowing when enough is enough. And you can't get to contentment without knowing that truth as well. And we hear today in the Epistle of St. Paul to the Galatians, which is the reading for St. Sergius, he says the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law. And that's a beautiful list, right? That's another one. You put on that on the motivational poster. Okay? The fruits of the Spirit. And we like that list. We like love, joy, goodness, kindness. But how many of us really, really, really like the last piece? Self-control. Because without self-control, that whole list falls apart. That's the point where we have to be able to say, enough is enough. That's what self-control is. First to ourselves, and then we'll be able to say it to everything that comes our way. Without the step of self-control, we will never know what it means to go on to the very next verse of Galatians. And those who are Christ's have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. How are we going to crucify our desires without knowing how to say no to ourselves? Our love and our peace and our joy will be nice, but it will always be dimmed and compromised without adding self-control, because we'll never be content. Our gentleness and our kindness and our goodness will be vulnerable to a bad temper and a bad attitude, to moodiness, because we will not know how to deny ourselves enough to endure need, to endure suffering. We'll only want to abound. And because we have not cultivated a true spirit of self-sufficiency and self-limitation, our patience and our faith will always feel like they are being put to the test. Contentment does not exist without self-control. But finding the spirit of contentment is at the heart of the gospel message. We sing it every Sunday in the Beatitudes. Did you know that? We begin with it. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. To be poor in spirit is to be self-limited, to be willingness to go without for the sake of others. And it's very poetic, but it's very easy to miss that implication. Now, St. Luke, when he gives the Beatitudes in chapter 6, which we also heard in the reading for St. Sergius, is rather more straightforward. He said, blessed are you poor, not just poor in spirit, blessed are you poor. For yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you shall be filled. And blessed are you who weep now, for you shall laugh. Accepting limitation in this life today opens for us the possibility of experiencing limitless joy and enrichment later that we would otherwise never know. That is why St. Paul says, now godliness with contentment is great gain. Not, it's just good for you. It's great gain. It's extremely profitable for your soul. And we begin to experience this great gain even in this life when we begin to taste those fruits of the Spirit, because we're walking in the Spirit. We're walking in the kingdom of heaven today. These riches that we speak of are heavenly, and they put earthly riches and cares to rest. So how then can we practice contentment meaningfully? How do I do it, Father? Thinking in terms of the kingdom is therefore crucial. That means you have to think beyond this life, which also means you have to think about the fact that there's an end to this life. Sorry to say. The Holy Fathers have said that the remembrance of death is the mother of virtues, and they are not kidding. And interestingly enough, and I'll conclude with a little bit for this, thanks to your patience, a recent article in Psychology Today talks about a psychologist who has basically rediscovered what the Church Fathers have been telling us all along, that the remembrance of death is actually good for you psychologically. Can you believe that? Read the following. Dr. Irvin Yalom, a noted psychiatrist interested in the interplay between spirituality and psychology, has done extensive work with cancer patients and their families. He found that the monumental shock of such a diagnosis results in far-reaching changes in the patient's life, including, surprisingly, a rearrangement of life's priorities. What is trivial emerges as such and can be ignored. A sense of liberation, being able to choose not to do those things you wish not to do. To finally have the courage to say no to yourself and to others. An enhanced sense of living in the immediate present rather than postponing life until some future point. A vivid appreciation of the elemental facts of life, the changing seasons, the wind, the falling leaves, the last Christmas, and so forth. Before liturgy today, we sang the Akathis, Glory to God for all things. That hymn is the epitome of that spirit, recognizing the beauty of all of life. Deeper communication with loved ones than before the crisis. Fewer interpersonal fears, less concern about rejection, greater willingness to take risks than before. So confronting the idea of death makes us live more fully in the present. We don't know what tomorrow will bring. We only have this day, this moment. When we are fully present in the moment, not thinking about the future, we're less likely to plague ourselves with the what-ifs of life. Ian Fleming famously quoted or wrote, "You only live twice, once when you're born and once when you die." You know, the thrill of those moments is true life. But for the Christian, that's pathetic, actually, to live like James Bond. Live every day as if it's your last. That's what he's saying. Luckily, he says you don't have to be diagnosed with cancer or go through some catastrophic event to live life more fully in the present. All it takes is an awareness, we could say a remembrance, of the time-limited nature of existence and a willingness and openness to let this awareness inspire your everyday life. Try this, he says. The next time you find yourself dwelling needlessly on something, ask yourself this: if I knew this was my last day on earth, would I choose to spend it worrying about this? Likely you wouldn't. So if you would not be concerned about it then, why are you worried about it now? So that's your homework for the next week. I'm giving homework every week. Your homework is to identify 3 things whatever, 3 things or more that you are thinking about that you might as well not. Because if it was your last day, you would bother. And in so doing, you will begin to be practicing the art of contentment in your daily life. Through the prayers of our Holy Father Sergius, Lord Jesus Christ our God, have mercy on us and save us. Amen. Christ is among us.